She sang Boop Oopa Doop and captured hearts with those big eyes and that squeaky voice. Betty Boop was the cartoon queen of the 1930s, dancing across movie screens when America needed her most. But behind that innocent face were scandals, censorship battles, and secrets that shocked Hollywood. Here are Betty Boop, 1933 to 1939, 10 wild facts you didn't know.
That one too, so we lay down. Bye-bye.
Number 10. She started as a dog. When Betty Boop first appeared in 1930, she wasn't the glamorous flapper we remember. She was literally a French poodle. Created by animator Grim Natwick at Fleischer Studios, Betty made her debut in the cartoon Dizzy Dishes as a dog-woman hybrid with long, floppy ears and a snout. The character was designed to parody singer Helen Kane, who was famous for her baby talk singing style. Kane had sued the studio for using her image in other cartoons, but that didn't stop Fleischer from creating what was essentially an animated version of her. The first Betty had a black nose, walked on all fours occasionally, and had distinctly canine features. She was meant to be a minor character, a singing waitress who appeared briefly. But audiences responded to something in Betty that the animators didn't expect. Letters poured into Fleischer Studios asking for more of the poodle girl. Theater owners reported that people came specifically to see cartoons with Betty in them. Max Fleischer recognized an opportunity. The transformation from dog to human happened gradually across several cartoons. By 1932, the floppy ears had transformed into hoop earrings. The snout disappeared, and Betty's face became round and human. Animators worked carefully to keep Betty recognizable while making these changes. They'd show her from certain angles to hide the transformation, then reveal her new look in the next cartoon. If you watch the early Betty Boop cartoons in order, you can see her literally evolve from canine to human. In Mysterious Moe's from 1930, she still has dog ears. In Silly Scandals from 1931, the ears are smaller and her face is more human. By Betty Boop's Bamboo Isle in 1932, she's completely human except for the name. Max Fleischer later said the change came because audiences were more interested in Betty than the main characters she was supposed to support. She stole every scene she was in, whether she was singing, dancing, or just reacting to the chaos around her. By the time Stopping the Show premiered in 1932, Betty was 100% human and 100% a star. The transformation took nearly 2 years of cartoons, but it created one of the most beloved characters in animation history. Number 9. Helen Kane sued and lost. Helen Kane was furious when she saw Betty Boop. The famous singer recognized her own voice, style, and mannerisms in the cartoon character. Kane's signature boop oopa doop phrase, her baby talk singing, even her dance moves, all of it showed up in Betty Boop cartoons. She felt Fleischer Studios had stolen her identity and was profiting from it. In 1932, Kane sued Fleischer Studios and Paramount Pictures for $250,000, claiming they'd stolen her identity without permission or compensation. That was an enormous sum during the Great Depression, equivalent to millions today. The lawsuit went to trial in 1934, and it became one of the most talked about cases in entertainment history. Newspapers covered it extensively. Radio programs discussed it. Everyone had an opinion about whether a cartoon could steal someone's identity. But here's where it gets interesting. During the trial, Fleischer's lawyers did extensive research into the history of the boop oop a doop singing style. They found footage of an African-American singer named Baby Esther, who had performed this exact style years before Helen Kane became famous. Baby Esther, whose real name was Esther Jones, had appeared at the Cotton Club in Harlem in the 1920s, performing with a baby voice and interpolating boop oop a doop into jazz songs. The defense presented evidence that Kane had actually seen Baby Esther perform at the Cotton Club in 1928. They argued that if Kane had borrowed the style from Baby Esther, she couldn't claim ownership of it. Kane's lawyers tried to dispute this, but the evidence was clear. Multiple witnesses testified they'd seen baby Esther performing the style before Kane adopted it. The judge ruled against Helen Kane. She lost the lawsuit and had to pay court costs, which put her in financial difficulty. Her career never recovered from the embarrassment. She'd tried to prove Betty Boop copied her, only to have it revealed that she'd copied someone else first. Baby Esther never received recognition or compensation either, though her contribution was crucial to Betty Boop's legal victory. She disappeared from public view by the time of the trial, and nobody knew where she was. It was a complicated situation that reflected the racial dynamics of 1930s America, where a black performer could create an entire style but receive no credit or money, while white performers fought over who owned it. Number 8. Mae Questel was Betty's secret voice. Betty Boop's distinctive voice came from Mae Questel, a teenager from the Bronx who won a Helen Kane impersonation contest. Questel was just 17 years old when Fleischer Studios hired her in 1931, fresh out of high school with no professional experience. She auditioned because she needed money during the Depression, never imagining she'd become the voice of one of the most famous characters in the world. But here's what most people don't know. Questel was never credited in the cartoons. For years, decades even, audiences had no idea who provided Betty's voice. They assumed it was Helen Kane, or maybe some famous actress doing uncredited work. Questel worked in complete anonymity while Betty became one of the most recognizable characters in the world. She earned a modest weekly salary while the cartoons made millions for Paramount and Fleischer Studios. The studio kept voice actors anonymous as a business strategy. If audiences didn't know who voiced the characters, the studio maintained complete control. Actors couldn't demand higher pay or leave for better opportunities. They were replaceable, even if their voices were unique. Mae Questel understood this, but needed the work too desperately to complain. Questel later said she'd record Betty's lines in a small sound booth at the Fleischer Studios building in New York. The booth was cramped and hot, with poor ventilation. She'd usually finish several cartoons in a single afternoon, sometimes recording for 4 or 5 hours straight. The directors would give her basic direction. Sound more excited here, or make this line sexier. But much of Betty's personality came from Questel's own interpretation. That baby talk voice was incredibly hard on her vocal cords. She'd come home hoarse after recording sessions, her throat raw from speaking in such an unnaturally high register. Doctors warned her she might damage her voice permanently, but she needed the income. The studio didn't care about the strain. If her voice gave out, they'd find someone else. Despite the anonymity and difficult working conditions, Questel continued voicing Betty Boop on and off for over 50 years. When the cartoons were revived on television in the 1950s, she returned to record new material. She voiced Betty in TV specials during the 1980s, by then in her 70s, but still able to produce that unmistakable sound. She also voiced Olive Oyl in Popeye cartoons and became one of the most prolific voice actors in animation history. But for most of her career, nobody knew her name. Only in the 1970s, when animation history became a subject of serious study, did Mae Questel finally receive public recognition as the voice of Betty Boop. Number 7. The Hays Code destroyed her career. Betty Boop's decline had everything to do with censorship. In 1934, the Motion Picture Production Code, known as the Hays Code, went into strict enforcement. This code dictated what could and couldn't appear in movies, and it was incredibly specific, and Betty Boop violated almost every rule. The code stated that women's clothing couldn't be suggestive or reveal too much skin. Her short skirt showing her garter, gone. Her curves and revealing outfits, covered up. The code banned what it called lustful kissing and any suggestion of sexuality outside marriage. The suggestive dancing that made Betty famous, banned entirely. Even her personality had to change. The flirtatious, independent Betty, who worked as a nightclub singer and ran her own business, suddenly became a housewife and babysitter. The censors examined every new Betty Boop cartoon frame by frame. They demanded changes to her costume, her movements, even her facial expressions. If Betty winked at the camera, the censors might object. If she moved her hips while walking, they'd order it reanimated. The studio received pages of notes for each cartoon, listing everything that violated the code. The transformation killed the character. Cartoons from 1935 onward show Betty in long skirts that went past her knees, conservative dresses with high necklines, and domestic situations that had nothing to do with the jazz age excitement of earlier cartoons. She went from a nightclub performer to a school teacher, from a modern woman living independently to someone who needed male protection, from a flapper to a school marm in less than a year. The censorship extended beyond just Betty's appearance. The surreal, sometimes dark content of early Betty Boop cartoons disappeared completely. No more ghosts, no more scary situations, no more adult humor. Everything had to be safe and suitable for children. The jazz music was toned down. The celebrity cameos stopped. Even Betty's catchphrase, boop oopa doop, appeared less frequently because censors thought it sounded suggestive. Audiences noticed immediately. Betty Boop's popularity plummeted. Theater owners stopped requesting Betty Boop cartoons. Paramount's distribution numbers dropped. By 1939, Fleischer Studios stopped making Betty Boop cartoons entirely because they weren't profitable anymore. The Hays Code had effectively ended her career. Max Fleischer later admitted that trying to make Betty respectable removed everything that made her special. She was designed to be a little bit naughty, a little bit dangerous, a symbol of the freedom women had claimed in the 1920s. When the code forced her to be proper and conservative, there was no point to the character anymore. Betty Boop without the boop was just another cartoon character, and audiences weren't interested. Number 6. She was based on multiple real women. Betty Boop wasn't just inspired by Helen Kane. Animator Grim Natwick drew from several real women when designing her. Clara Bow, the original It Girl of silent films, provided Betty's bobbed hairstyle and heart-shaped face. Bow's bee-stung lips and wide eyes became Betty's signature features. Joan Crawford's pencil-thin eyebrows showed up on Betty. The dramatic makeup and expressive eyes came directly from Crawford's look in early talkies. Some animators admitted they'd watch Crawford films and sketch her facial expressions to use in cartoons. Actress Gertrude Saunders, an African-American performer, influenced Betty's style as well. Saunders was known for her energetic dancing and baby talk singing in Harlem clubs during the 1920s. Elements of her performance style appear in early Betty Boop cartoons. Even Louise Brooks, the silent film star with the iconic black bob, contributed to Betty's look. The contrast between Brooks's sophisticated appearance and Betty's childlike voice created an interesting tension that defined the character. Betty Boop was a composite of the most glamorous women of her era mixed together into one cartoon character.
Course I gotta told if I don't. Course I gotta told if.
Number 5. The cartoons featured major jazz artists. Betty Boop cartoons showcased some of the greatest musicians of the 1930s. Cab Calloway appeared in 3 Betty Boop cartoons, performing in his signature white tuxedo. In Minnie the Moocher from 1932, Calloway sang and danced while the animators rotoscoped his movements, creating one of the most famous scenes in animation history. Louis Armstrong appeared in I'll Be Glad When You're Dead, You Rascal You in 1932. His performance was rotoscoped, meaning animators traced his live-action movements frame by frame to create realistic animation. The cartoon was controversial because it included racial stereotypes common at the time, but Armstrong's musical performance was preserved for history. The Royal Samoans, Don Redman and his orchestra, and other prominent bands appeared in Betty Boop cartoons. These weren't just voice performances. The musicians' actual movements were captured and transformed into animation. It created a unique record of how these artists performed. Fleischer Studios was located in New York, right in the heart of the jazz scene. Max Fleischer had connections to clubs and musicians throughout the city. He used Betty Boop cartoons as a way to showcase the music he loved while creating something commercially successful. Number 4. She appeared in over 100 cartoons. Between 1930 and 1939, Betty Boop appeared in 110 theatrical cartoons. That's more than one cartoon per month for 9 years straight. To put that in perspective, most animated characters today might appear in 20 or 30 cartoons over their entire existence. Betty's output was staggering. The Fleischer Studios animation team worked constantly to meet demand. Each cartoon ran about 7 minutes and required thousands of hand-drawn frames. Every movement Betty made had to be drawn individually on paper, then traced onto clear celluloid sheets, painted, and photographed. A single second of animation required 24 individual drawings. 7 minutes meant over 10,000 drawings per cartoon, and they were making these cartoons every few weeks. Animators worked 6 days a week in the Fleischer Studios building on Broadway in New York. The building had multiple floors dedicated to Betty Boop production. One floor for pencil animation, another for inking and painting, another for photography. The studio employed dozens of artists, and they all worked on tight deadlines. Missing a release date wasn't an option. Theaters had scheduled Betty Boop cartoons months in advance. The animators developed shortcuts and techniques to speed up production. They created libraries of common movements that could be reused. Betty's walk cycle, for instance, was drawn once and used in multiple cartoons. Background elements were recycled. If a cartoon needed a nightclub interior, they'd reuse backgrounds from previous nightclub cartoons. Some sequences appeared in multiple cartoons with only minor changes. These shortcuts were necessary for survival, but they also created a distinctive style. Betty Boop cartoons have a consistent look because the same artists drew her again and again. They knew exactly how her hair moved, how her dress swayed, how her eyes blinked. That repetition created familiarity for audiences. The cartoons played in theaters before feature films. Going to the movies in the 1930s meant watching a cartoon, a newsreel, sometimes a serial adventure, and then the main feature. People arrived early, specifically to see the cartoons. Betty Boop cartoons were a guaranteed draw. Theater owners specifically requested them because audiences loved them. A theater could advertise "New Betty Boop cartoon" on their marquee and sell more tickets. At the height of her popularity in 1932 to 1933, Betty Boop cartoons generated more money than many live-action features. They cost less to produce than a feature film, but drew comparable audiences. Paramount Pictures distributed them worldwide, and Betty became an international sensation. In some countries, she was more popular than Mickey Mouse. In France, she was called Betty Boop. In Japan, she became a cultural phenomenon. The cartoons were translated, dubbed, and shown everywhere movies existed.
Is this over here now?
Number 3. Betty Boop's sexuality was groundbreaking and controversial. Betty Boop was the first animated character designed to be sexually attractive. This wasn't an accident or something that happened gradually. It was intentional from the moment she became human. Her garter, short skirt, and curves were deliberate design choices. She winked at the audience. She sang suggestive songs. And she knew exactly what she was doing. The animators gave her bedroom eyes and a body that moved in ways that emphasized her femininity. In Betty Boop's Bamboo Isle from 1932, she performs a hula dance in a grass skirt that was scandalously brief by 1930s standards. The animation emphasized her hip movements and showed her body in profile in ways that left little to the imagination. The cartoon was banned in several cities for being too provocative. Boston banned it. Detroit banned it. Church groups organized protests. In Boop Oopa Doop from 1932, a circus ringmaster tries to force himself on Betty in her dressing room, and she fights him off while screaming for help. The cartoon dealt with sexual assault in a way that was shockingly direct for the time. It showed the ringmaster chasing Betty, grabbing at her, trying to corner her. The implications were clear, even though nothing explicit was shown. The cartoon ended with Betty escaping and the ringmaster getting his comeuppance, but the subject matter horrified many viewers. Some cartoons showed Betty in various states of undress. In Betty Boop's Penthouse from 1933, she appears in her slip getting ready for bed. In Betty Boop's Rise to Fame, she's shown bathing behind a screen, with her silhouette visible. The animators played with the line between cute and seductive constantly. Betty would innocently pull up her stocking, and the camera would linger on her leg. She'd lean forward, and the angle would emphasize her figure. These weren't accidents. They were calculated choices that made some people very uncomfortable. Women's groups protested Betty Boop cartoons regularly. The Catholic Legion of Decency condemned them as immoral. Editorial writers in newspapers called them inappropriate for children, questioning why such material was shown in family theaters. Parent-teacher associations demanded Betty Boop cartoons be banned from afternoon showings when children might be present. But the cartoons kept making money, so they kept getting made, until the Hays Code forced everything to change. The pre-code Betty Boop cartoons captured a brief moment in American culture when movies could be risque, when jazz was king, and when flappers challenged traditional morality. Women had just won the right to vote, they'd shortened their skirts, they were smoking in public and dancing in clubs. Betty represented all of that freedom and rebellion. When censorship arrived in 1934, that era ended, and so did the real Betty Boop. The postcode Betty wore long skirts and taught school. She was asexual, safe, boring. The character that had pushed boundaries became a model of propriety. And audiences lost interest almost immediately because Betty without the sexuality wasn't really Betty at all. Number 2. Max Fleischer fought to keep her alive. Max Fleischer created Betty Boop through his studio, but he never owned the rights to his most famous character. Paramount Pictures held the copyright because they financed the cartoons and distributed them. This became crucial when the Hays Code threatened to destroy the character Fleischer had built. Fleischer tried everything to keep Betty relevant after 1934. He pitched new story ideas where Betty could work within the censorship rules. He suggested different costumes that might satisfy the censors while keeping some of Betty's appeal. He even considered aging her into a mature woman, a Mrs. Betty Boop, who could be sophisticated without being sexual. Nothing worked. The censors wanted Betty completely sanitized, and Paramount executives weren't interested in fighting them. They wanted safe, family-friendly content that wouldn't cause controversy. The financial pressure on Fleischer Studios intensified as Betty's popularity declined. By 1936, the studio was struggling to stay profitable. The sanitized Betty cartoons didn't generate the revenue the pre-code cartoons had. Theater owners weren't requesting them as frequently. Paramount reduced the budget for each cartoon, which meant lower quality animation and less interesting stories. By 1939, Fleischer was in serious financial trouble. His studio had invested heavily in 2 feature films, Gulliver's Travels and later, Mr. Bug Goes to Town. Both projects drained resources because feature animation was far more expensive than shorts. The studio took out loans to finance these films. Gulliver's Travels did reasonably well, but Mr. Bug Goes to Town was a commercial disaster. Betty Boop cartoons became too expensive to produce for the limited returns they generated after censorship gutted the character. The final Betty Boop cartoon, Yip Yip Yippee, premiered in August 1939. It was a war-themed short where Betty encouraged Americans to support the troops preparing for what would become World War II. There was nothing special about it, no acknowledgement that it was the end of an era. Betty Boop just disappeared from theaters with no fanfare, no final send-off, no recognition that one of the most popular characters in animation history was finished. Fleischer lost his studio to Paramount in 1942 after defaulting on loans. The company was renamed Famous Studios, and Betty Boop was shelved indefinitely. Fleischer spent the rest of his life trying to reclaim his creations, including Betty Boop, Popeye, and Superman cartoons his studio had produced. He never succeeded. He died in 1972, long before Betty's resurrection in popular culture during the 1980s, never knowing that his creation would become more famous and profitable after her death than she ever was during her original run. Number 1. She became more popular after she died. Betty Boop disappeared from theaters in 1939, but she never really went away. In the 1950s, her old cartoons started appearing on television. A whole new generation discovered her. By the 1960s, Betty was a pop culture icon again. The pre-code cartoons, the ones made before censorship, fascinated people. They represented a time of freedom and rebellion that seemed exotic compared to the buttoned-up 1950s. College students in the 1960s embraced Betty as a symbol of counterculture. In the 1970s and 1980s, Betty Boop merchandise exploded. Her image appeared on everything from t-shirts to lunchboxes to tattoos. Companies paid licensing fees to use her likeness. She became more profitable as a brand than she ever was as a cartoon character. Several attempts to revive Betty in new cartoons failed. A 1988 TV special didn't capture the magic. The 1930s, Betty was a product of her time, and that specific combination of jazz, pre-code freedom, and hand-drawn animation couldn't be recreated. Today, Betty Boop remains one of the most recognizable cartoon characters ever created. She appears in advertising, fashion, and pop culture worldwide. The character that censorship tried to destroy became immortal. That squeaky voice and those big eyes still represent the freedom and fun of the jazz age, nearly a century after she first said boop oopa doop. Betty Boop was more than just a cartoon character. She was a cultural phenomenon who reflected the hopes, fears, and changes of 1930s America. From her strange beginning as a dog to her battles with censorship, from the talented people who created her to her unexpected immortality, Betty's story is full of surprises. If you enjoyed learning these wild facts about Betty Boop, make sure to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more fascinating stories from Hollywood's golden age. What surprised you most about Betty Boop? Let us know in the comments below.